thanks a lot for having me, and it's always great to come here. Sorry about my voice, I got sick on the plane and I must be getting old. Now, when we talk about the relationship between Central Asia and the Gulf state, the Arab part of the Gulf state, it's a very telling aspect in general terms of the international relation of globalizing Asia. The trend in the last 20 years has been that sub-regions across the wide Asian continent interact with each other. The China-Gulf relation, the China-Myanmar relation, the Gulf-Japan relation, the Central Asia-Japan relation, are all pieces in this puzzle, which is this big but more and more interconnected continent in which these star parts interact politically, economically, somehow financially, and also to people-to-people linkages. But the Central Asia-Gulf relationship, that's one of my main points today, is particularly important because it's the acid test to understand how much post-Soviet Central Asia has been introduced or reintroduced in the global Ummah. The inclusion of Central Asia in global Islamic politics does primarily, although not exclusively, to the relationship that Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and so on have established with the Gulf state, especially Saudi Arabia. And to some extent, if you want, the way in which the Central Asian leaderships look at their religious component or their linkages with the Gulf is a mirror of how they look at their domestic Islam. Of course, it's the mirror in which you will never see each other yourself, because it's always different from what you expect to do. But nonetheless, it's a mirror. So you've got this dual intersection of, if you want, religious, political, but also state-centric. My paper today, it's mostly about state relationship. I did some research on the Gulf and Kazakhstan, especially the GCC, in a couple of years ago when I spent field work in both the Gulf and in Kazakhstan to see how religion influences, if in any way, mutual perception and political, economic, and financial issues. And the main conclusion, which got reinforced by further research, is that there are two logics which dominate this relationship. On the one hand, you have the logic of authoritarian control, with the Central Asian state enforced upon their domestic Islam. And then you got the logic of insulation, which is applied to make the domestic community impermeable to influences from the Gulf. If you remember, in the early 90s, there was a lot of discussion on the literature about Central Asia reopened for business with the Gulf, the new parts of the Ummah, going back to how, you know, the model, the Turkish model, the Saudi model, the Iranian model, which of course end up in nothing. But one issue remains central to what we have here, is because of the region's authoritarian governments, foreign Islam has been equated rhetorically, but not insignificantly, to dangerous Islam. And the Central Asians do that by referring to the foreign Islam, which they usually mean from the Gulf. I mean, they never use the word Khaliji, which is what you call them if you were speaking Arabic, but is a fact that you do have a perception of some kind of Gulf Islam which is seen with preoccupation by the states in Central Asia. And, you know, the work of Adil Khalid really unearthed how this connection worked in Uzbekistan. I can tell you my personal experience that when I was in Kazakhstan last time, I could hear across the Russian radio a lot of programs that they were sort of describing the idiosyncrasies of Saudi Islam, witchcraft I got punished in a Wahhabi context. So there was a sort of battle against the foreign influences, which we've seen a couple of weeks ago in Tajikistan, when the Khatlam police progressed with a sort of long wave of repression, and just a few sort of data. They closed 162 shops which were selling hijabs and Muslim female wear. They convinced more than 1,500 women to get rid of the hijab. So they demuhajiba, those were muhajibas. And also they forced more than 12,000 men to cut their beards. Always on the name of foreign influences. Now, when you mean foreign, you don't mean Italy or Scotland. You clearly mean the Gulf. That kind of Wahhabi Islam that is actually becoming, if you want, the central preoccupation to these governments. But you cannot, and we ought not to, analyze Islam in isolation. We can only make sense of how Islam works within the political, the economic, the commercial relations with Central Asia if we put in the context of wider linkages. And that's where my prior research has helped me, because my main argument was that Kazakhstan and the Gulf, especially, could not really sort of interact successfully because of what I call the dilemmas of compatibility. They were too similar. Compatible energy outlook, in the sense they were both exporter. Islam were used rhetorically on both sides, but with sort of diverging objectives, and that had an impact on what the development of the relationship, which is not as intense as you expect, at least 20 years ago, and at least if you look at the wider pattern of inter-Asian relationship, but also in relation to the centrality of the state, which became virtually the exclusive actor in the relationship itself. So my research showed that was people-to-people dimension when it comes to Kazakhstan and the Gulf, it's mostly non-existent. The state is central, is the engine of everything, and if you look at how the whole relationship started, it was Nazarbayev who personally donated 2 very large hunting reserves to the Hanakyan families in southern Kazakhstan Oblast. That's how it started. So these people would fly in Abu Dhabi, do the hunting, and go back in Kazakhstan on a personal donation of the president. So, and this, we'll see this in a couple of examples which I put on the Islamic financing bank. So it is the kind of exclusive relationship with marginalized people-to-people contacts. If you look at the number of tourism, with the notable exception of Dubai, people don't travel across the Gulf to Central Asia and the other way around. There isn't much going on. Despite the very consistent, considerably large number of flights, which there are these days. And also, non-state actors, in the case of Islam, remain marginalized, if not altogether excluded. So this is the context in which we operate, in which the religion, which in Central Asia has become, again, subjected to what the state wants, because of the creation of this spiritual directorate, which are very similar to what the Soviets used to do. It's just not called Soviets, because of the logic of authoritarian governments, subjugated non-state relation in a state context, de facto impeding the development of serious people-to-people engagement, which is the main problem here when it comes to Islam. Now, one good thing which literature, people that have been working on this, have been doing the last 20 years is constantly challenging the idea that Central Asia Islam is not compatible with whatever would happen anywhere else. So, this is mostly Noah Tucker, which always says that discussions about whether this is real or not are going on every day within the Central Asia Ummah. These people do ask themselves and answer in different way at different times for different countries why their way of doing Islam is different, or how it relates to more established forms of belief. So in this sense, we operate now, after 20 years of, as Marlene said, most anthropological studies, in context in which, in principle, it's not impossible to import into Central Asia form of Islam established elsewhere. But in practice, this has become impossible because of the state's unrelentingly resilient attitude towards impermeability of their own communities to the Gulf Stream especially. So we haven't been able to see any, or in most cases, any form of Islam established elsewhere in both New Central Asia, because the state has created their own form, which is conformed to nothing else than their own logic of authoritarian governance. By putting themselves both at the center of norm-making, institution-making vis-à-vis the Islamic community, but also in relation to the marginalization of sub-state, non-state, and extraterritorial actors when it comes to the relationship with big ideological powers, mostly the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I just want, and I did this, and I will keep on doing this in relation to three issues. Islamic finance, Islamic education, and Hajj, the pilgrimage. Today, since I got a colleague who will speak about the Islamic development banking, I will just have a very quick point about about education. And I'll focus mostly about the Hajj later on. So, my impression when I interviewed people in relation to the future of Islamic banking in Central Asia, and mostly in Kazakhstan, was that whatever they had going on was the essential reproduction of a personal pact between President Nazarbayev and the Hanahian family in Abu Dhabi. Most likely Sheikh Khalifa himself. So the Sheikh convinced Nazarbayev, and I go into my Journal of Arabic Studies paper about the long process of law-making and introduction and amendments of constitution to go to that. It was the prince himself who told Nazarbayev, you got to open this bank, do that, because I own the bank, and we can make some deal for the community. But there are two major conditions there. That the bank, it's not retailing. It's just for, so it's not a day-to-day operation. And also, when I asked my informants about what will happen to their job when Nazarbayev dies, they pretty much all made me understand that the bank might close. So it was a end-by-date agreement which introduced significantly, yet temporarily, a practice of religious that has got some origins in the Gulf instead. So and there is an article on this month, International Affairs, which actually in different way, different kind of research methods, but convincingly nonetheless, in which they argue that Islamic banking in Kazakhstan, it's more of a form of sustainable development than a religious endeavor. So in that sense, you see that even though the government allowed the introduction of religious form of cooperation, they try to minimize in time, space, and context the importance that Gulf Islam plays vis-a-vis these things. Very quick word before I go to the Hajj about the mosques. My impression when I was in Kazakhstan last time was the government was very wary of allowing the funds flowing from the Gulf, especially Saudi Arabia, to build mosques in Kazakhstan. For some reason, they did focus, they did allow money to run, to flow into the day-to-day, if you want, running of the mosque. But there was a, if you want, deliberate intention to limit the impact that foreign funds might have on this. But this was always a more marginal issue from universities. But you see much more clearly when it comes to higher education. There aren't many religious institutions in Central Asia, and there aren't many Central Asians that are allowed to study in Al-Azhar, in Medina, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, and if they're allowed, there's something behind usually there because they want to go. And now to the main point of this, the pilgrimage, the Hajj, which is probably the most important episode of globalized Islam now, as it always been the case, but now even more because of globalization, time, space shrinks, is something which in Central Asia, and this across the region now, is seen with extreme difference. There is a systematic action of control. And that's the article which really says the Hajj has become state-sponsored. So whoever goes, or most of those who go, are actually going because the state allows them to go. And again, it's the logic of impermeability, having these people exchanging ideas and then coming back. And if you know, mutandis, this is the same thing as doing extraterritorial rendition in Moscow for Tajik people that they think they are radicalized by Daesh over there or by someone else. So, but here we have two attitudes towards the Hajj. The first one, which I find fascinating, is the president. The president, and we got the example, Ahmad was there 2 weeks ago, was doing the Umrah in Makkah. Why would he go? I can't really see any religious sentiment behind it. It must be, and it is cosmetic. But the president has been using the Hajj for different shades of similarly framed opportunism, which could be either an image-making strategy or a case of just funding. There is anecdotal evidence of Niazov in '92 going to Mecca and apparently drinking on the plane. And then and he was telling his colleagues on the plane, the first thing I'll do when I go and I meet the king, I'll ask him for $1 million. And that's what he did. He went in just for asking funding, so $1 billion, not $1 million. Also, Akayev, in 1992, scientists, different backgrounds, declared that he would only do the Hajj if we got $100 million US package from the US, from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. He clearly said, I'm a communist, or a former communist, I'm a secular guy, I'm not going to do a this charade for at least $1 million, $1 million. He didn't get the money, but in '94 he went nonetheless. He went to do the Hajj anyway, because he got the idea that a photo op with the Al Saud is actually great for domestic legitimacy, which is the same thing that Nazarbayev did in '92, when he was there in September, and he was allowed in the Kaaba and touch the stone, and that is an element that the propaganda lists all the time. And by the way, that's exactly the same episode that was censored by the Tajik propaganda 2 weeks ago about Rahman's wife, who not only went to do the Umrah, but was even allowed within the Kaaba by the Saudi government. So there is a perception that it's important being seen as Muslim, good Muslim who do the Hajj, even though you then go home and you implement systematic agenda of repression of Islam. And that's where the branding component of that, it becomes an instrument of both personal promotion as well as, if you want, image making. And my last point, I think I haven't got much to do, is the numbers. Hajj has become state-controlled, state-organized, state-tolerated, state-censored. If you look at the numbers, so people that are allowed to go, well, Turkmenistan only did 55. Oh, I wonder why 55 for 10 years. So that's how many fit in the only plane they will send over. They're sending 55 pilgrims every year to go to Central to do the Hajj, because one plane, that's it, 55. Numbers have increased. Kazakhstan, 40 pilgrims in '92, 5,000 pilgrims last year. Of course, this is well below the quota. The quota is really 1,000 pilgrims for a million population. So Kazakhstan will have 16,000. They only a third. But also Uzbekistan, 1250, 91, 5,000 last year. But what's more interesting than the numbers is the fact how much they pay. Because state organization, I mean, having a Hajj which is state-sponsored involves a whole array of intermediate steps to go to Mecca. And the first one is paying the state agency who's organizing trips, visas, and accommodation. And they determine the price. And listen to this. Tajikistan, in between 2005 and 2006, the price of the Hajj increment by 25%. So you pay a quarter more full. In 2015, Tajikistani Hujjaj would pay 3,800 US to go in. Kyrgyz, they would pay almost 4,000 US to go in. The Kazakhs in between 3.2 and 3.9. But it's not just that. We know how it works in Central Asia, that before going to the Hajj, you had to have the people coming over to your place, you need to give them presents, so it's another, if no more than that. So we could calculate that one Haji, one pilgrim from Kyrgyzstan or from Kazakhstan will spend in between $6,000 and $7,000 to go down. That's something which is hard on people who live in the Western world. Think about the people living there. But that's what the government wants them to do. And it's not only expensive, it's also corrupt. And there are many testimonies, especially on the Eurasian end, of Tajikistani pilgrims who go and speak with Western journalists, and they say that they pay extra on top of what they're required to pay, so that they go up the ladder and they get into the into the list earlier on. Which, of course, when you're older, it's only human. If I can go next year, I don't know what it will be like next year. That's it. So that's interesting time, that this instrument of limiting and transforming what is probably the most personal experience of Islam, of religious belief, into a state-centered practice which is shaped essentially and almost exclusively by the perception of the state as God or its own authoritarianism, is what we could call the branding that we have here. A kind of Islam which is state-centric, not exposed to what happened to the Gulf, and it could be unsustainable, but we don't know. And thanks a lot.